Hello, my name is Matt Foy. For people that don't know me, I worked with Fisheries and Oceans, the Salmon Enhancement Program, and was involved with the development of the Mamquam Channel over this period, 1983 to 2015, when I retired. This is a history of how it was developed, some of the thoughts behind it, some of the observations in terms of operation over the years. This presentation is being done just to pass on this knowledge to the stewards and the managers of the habitat today, just to make sure they have the best information for making decisions that is good for this habitat in the future. Hopefully you'll enjoy the presentation and learn a few things you might not have known about this area. I know there's a lot of people appreciate the habitat values of the Mamquam Channel complex. It's a unique place in Squamish to see salmon and eagles and all sorts of wildlife in a very pedestrian-friendly environment. Hope you enjoy the presentation. For those that like to maybe jump around on this presentation and look at certain sections that they find interesting, it actually talks in four sort of themes. I call them modules. Module 1 is talking about the early phase of the Mamquam Channel from that 1983 to 1996 period. Module 2 covers the period after the second phase of the project was done in the 90s, so that's 1996 to 2021. Information about various things that have been observed and various studies that have been undertaken during that period. Module 3, slides 23 to 28, talks about observations on the behavior of the Mamquam River aquifer and how it affects the channel habitats. And this section also suggests a citizen science project to look at this subject in more depth. So Module 4, slides 29 to 32, just a summary of things that could be done to keep the Mamquam Channel productive for salmon in coming years. I hope you enjoy this history. You'll notice as you go through the presentation, I've showed various links on different slides that are usually goes to a research paper or an article or perhaps a short video that is relevant to what's being discussed in the presentation. Now, I've listed them, all these references, all these links here, but for the YouTube version, if you go to the description of the YouTube, the links are also there, and that's where you would access the links. So watch the presentation, perhaps make note of what slide number, and then go back to the beginning of the presentation and look at the description. You should be able to get the link and read some interesting background information. Hope you enjoy. So we dug up some old pictures of the Mamquam Channel just the year after its original construction. So I think people might have heard it was actually built not its primary role as a salmon spawning area. It was actually a gravel removal area to build the dikes around Squamish. And the salmon enhancement staff, two individuals, Dave Marshall, which was a biologist, and Ray Finicum from SEP at the time, requested the BC ministry, who was planning to simply scalp river bars in the area, if they would in fact dig a deep channel through a floodplain forest and see if we could create a groundwater habitat for salmon. In that case, it was mainly for chum salmon. So this was a technique that was developed in southern BC. There had been a number of projects done in just a very few years before this time, but this was the first time where we turned sort of an industrial activity into creating salmon habitat. So it very much was an experiment. And it was a very creative experiment that worked out very, very well. So this is a picture of the channel 1 year after construction. And if you look down each side, rock was placed. This is armoring rock that was placed primarily to keep the spawning salmon from digging in the banks, and that would bring too much gravel into the channel because this isn't a natural channel. There's no floods. The gravel would slowly build up, and at some point the flow could potentially stop. But also we learned from studies after this that those broken rock banks were really high quality winter habitat for species like coho smolts. And you'll see in the foreground there's a fish trap. So there was a research theme of the Mamquam Channel in its early years, because really this was all new technology. That's a trap, and a number of monitoring programs were done. So there you go, Mamquam Channel and its upper 360 meter section in 1984, and you can see the little setback berm up at the top. That's the berm that would protect it from the Mamquam River, which is just over that high spot of land. So this is just a little different shot showing that upper section of Mamquam Channel, roughly just probably 84, possibly the year after. You can sort of see some splashing. It looks like it's full of chum salmon. So this is in the early fall. Also notice the channel, these groundwater channels at their upper end are at 0% grade. They're dead flat. So they're not operating like a typical stream where the salmon lays eggs in a riffle, and it's the gradient, the energy of the water flowing down that riffle, that pushes the water through the gravel and brings oxygens to the eggs. This upper section of Mamquam Channel is dead flat. So how does that work? Well, what it is an upwelling groundwater spawning habitat. So the water is actually coming from below and going up through the eggs. It's not going down from the surface past the eggs, it's coming from below. There's hydrostatic head. This is a drainage channel draining the aquifer, and these chum salmon have adapted to seek out these upwellings. So that section is a very unique piece of habitat, very high productivity for species that use upwelling groundwater, and we'll talk more about those species. Also notice the gently sloping banks. Again, it was built to generate a lot of volume for building dikes. So those banks are sloped way back. Now normally we don't do that because we don't want to disturb the riparian forest too much, but in this case it was a gravel removal site and we got a spawning channel. I will say in later years that regenerated very quickly in alders and cottonwoods. You actually can see some small plants on the left that are already regenerating. And in the 1990s, at least on the right bank, quite a bit of conifer planting was done through the BC Forest Renewal Program. So if you go there today, it'll be a fully mature alder forest with an understory of conifers that were planted in the 1990s. So people that know the Mamquam Channel know that it's heavily used by chum salmon and coho salmon, but they may not know that it's actually used by a very small population of what's called Riverine Sockeye salmon that exist in the Mamquam River. So soon after construction, this looks around 1984, we observed spawning sockeye salmon in the groundwater areas. These types of sockeye appear to target upwelling groundwater zones. Now, they're never abundant, but if you do believe in biodiversity, these might be the most valuable fish in the Mamquam Channel. They're rare, and if you see a pair, you're probably very, very lucky. They're normally mixed in with chum salmon, and they might be seen to be a coho salmon, but they're much brighter red and actually quite small. Anyway, just want to flag it, the Riverine Sockeye of Mamquam Channel. Another reason why the Mamquam Channel is a very special place. So I mentioned that the Mamquam Channel was used as a bit of an experimental and study location in its early years. This is just a picture of that upper section on the left. You'll see that fish weir, but a little later in the season when the chum salmon came up, you can see it captured the carcasses and they were enumerated. Just have a note of the number of carcasses in and around the channel, but also there's live chums below. Just very, very high densities of chum salmon in these early years used the Mamquam Channel. So from those assessment studies, we learned also that this area was very, very productive for coho salmon, and that was not fully understood in those years. So in terms of chum salmon, it was found that the upper 2,000 square meters above the enumeration weir, that 360 meter upper section, produced chum fry per square meter as high as ever we recorded in any groundwater channel in British Columbia, roughly 500 fry per square meter. Now, being about 2,000 square meters in area in the upper section above that weir, that would roughly translating to around 1 million chum fry per year were produced above this enumeration weir. Now, if you want to know a little bit more about chum salmon fry production from groundwater channels in BC, a summary was done by one of our colleagues, Greg Bunnell, in 1991 that talks about how these things produce chum salmon fry, how many, their approximate cost, how they're designed. But just as a note, they're the most productive spawning habitat for chum salmon we know of, upwelling groundwater habitat, and therefore should be maintained and protected in the future if we want chum salmon to remain healthy in the Mamquam watershed. So I'm going to tell you a little bit of history related to the Mamquam Channel that many of you probably don't know. So it relates to the pink salmon population of the Squamish River. So in 1975, the pink salmon population effectively crashed, almost effectively disappeared. Pinks were not commonly seen after that point for probably more than a decade. And it was a combination of overfishing. There had been some very strong runs in the 60s, but the overfishing had driven the numbers down, and then there was a catastrophic flood that year in 1975. And of course, it was after a period of a couple decades of very heavy logging of the watershed. Anyway, the pink salmon population effectively disappeared. So after a decade of no recovery, in 1985, the Salmon Enhancement Program made an effort to reintroduce pink salmon to the Squamish River from the adjacent Indian River. And this reintroduction effort occurred from 1985 up to 1993, and it was carried out by collecting anywhere from 1 to 4 million eggs each odd year cycle on the nearby Indian River. And those eggs were incubated to the eyed stage at tenderfoot hatchery, but the water at the tenderfoot hatchery is groundwater, very warm groundwater, and we could not incubate those pink salmon for the entire phase because they would come out too early. They'd come out in January. We wanted them to come out in around early April. But we did find the newly constructed Mamquam channel had much cooler groundwater, which would have been adequate for finishing off these eggs. So the upper portion of the Mamquam channel, some coarser gravel was placed, a single layer of gravel, and these eggs were just scattered, a single layer on top of the gravel and then covered with black plastic. So that was the beginning of the pink salmon recovery program in the Squamish River. And it's an interesting story. I know at the time we were trying to capture as many native Squamish River pink salmon as we could. We worked very hard for 2 or 3 weeks on the Mamquam River and caught a grand total of 5 males. The run was effectively over. Within one cycle, the run had come up to 25,000 spawners as a result of the releases from Mamquam Channel. So Mamquam Channel was not envisioned as a place for those pink salmons to return to because typically it would be dry at its lower end when they did return in August and early September. But once in a while, we get an August-September flood event, which means the channel starts flowing and a heck of a lot of pinks show up, as they have recently done in 2021. Now, if they come in an early flood, late August, early September, often they come in and the channel will stop flowing again and they will be stranded. But probably their eggs are in the gravel or still moist and may survive. Anyway, if you want to read more about this pink salmon recovery story, there's a little story on this link. Is well worth your time to read. For just a little extra history on the Mamquam River Pink Salmon Recovery Program, and for those that have a technical interest, those incubation boxes used at tenderfoot were one of a kind. They were designed specifically for this program, and they were simple boxes that were placed in the existing capilano troughs with a screen bottom, and siphons were used to pull water up through the box and discharge into the next channel. And that, in fact, worked really well for incubating eggs to the eyed stage, 90% survival or more. So from there, those eyed eggs were moved to the very top end of Mamquam Channel. And as I mentioned, there had been a single layer of screen spawning gravel spread over the channel bottom. and then a layer of these eyed pink salmon eggs were spread over that gravel and covered up with black plastic. Now this was all to give them protection from predators. When they hatched, the little Elvins scooted down into that clean layer of gravel. Worked pretty well. I'm sure the coho smolts ate very well that winter, but at the end of the day, the survival to fry, where we ran a downstream trap at the enumeration weir, was better than 80%. So it was very well for a field type program. So in 1985, 1987, and 1989, approximately 1 million pink fry would have migrated out of the Mamquam Channel into the Mamquam River. And from the estimates from the fishery officers, from 15,000 to 25,000 returned to the Mamquam River to spawn after they had been in the ocean for a year and a half. So we also noticed that pink salmon started to pop up in various other tributaries of the Squamish River at that time, the Ashlew, the Cheakamus, and toward the end of the program, after the Mamquam River had been fully seeded by spawning pinks for at least 2 cycles and 3 cycles, we brought in another type of incubator we had designed for the field called the channel incubator and placed them in Moody's Channel on the Cheakamus River and a recently constructed little groundwater channel on the Squamish River. And the egg takes were increased at the Indian River, and at the peak about 3.5 million pink salmon fry were released into these 2 rivers in 1991 and 1993. Therefore, there was strong pink returns to all the rivers in the lower part of the Squamish watershed, and that program was discontinued, and the pink salmon never looked back. So I hope we never have to do this again, but this is a little history just in case someone has to. It was a lot of work, but the message is protect what we have. So we've talked a little bit about chum salmon production from the Mamquam system. Touched on a few sockeye do use it, and how pink salmon do use it in certain years. They're not a species we would expect to use the Mamquam Channel, but they do come in on these flood years in September, like they have in 2021. But when we started to look at coho salmon production from the Mamquam Channel, it became much more complicated. So those early years from that assessment program, just for that upper 2,000 square meters, it became clear that coho smolt production from that relatively simple channel that you see in this picture would produce coho smolts at extremely high levels, 3.1 smolts per square meter. This is really high. In nature, in a stream, it's about roughly 1,400 smolts per kilometer of stream, well, 1,000 meters, so 1.4 smolts per linear meter. But if that channel is 5-6 meters wide or as wide as the Cheakamus, the number of smolts per square meter is 0.1, 0.2, not 3.1. The upper part of the groundwater channel in Mamquam was an extremely high producing area for coho smolts. What we also learned during the period of assessment, we had a year 1986 where 50% of the study area dried, and then the extreme drought year of 1987 when the entire channel went dry. And what we learned was smolt production next spring was affected by these drying periods because it was a relatively shallow channel. There was no refuge holes at that time or pools at that time. So the numbers collapsed to almost negligible numbers of smolts in the 1987 complete drying period, and maybe 20% of normal in the half drying period. What we also learned from our trapping program was that an unexpectedly large number of coho fry left the channel early in the spring. The 2 years that I saw data in the one report, from 90 to 150,000 coho fry migrated out of the channel. That's not what stayed, that's what's left. Now later studies, when we were looking at the Squamish Estuary and even along the foreshore of Howe Sound, we found that coho fry were relatively common in both these areas. So it's not unreasonable to assume a significant portion of the Mamquam Channel coho fry actually migrate out of the channel, do not rear in the channel, and actually live in the Mamquam Squamish rivers, the Squamish Estuary, and potentially out in Howe Sound. Now, when you look at the numbers of fry moving, 90,000, if you said 1% of those survived to adulthood, that would be 900 to 1,500 adult coho coming back. Or even 0.5%, that's still 400 to 600. It very well could be that a very significant portion of the adult salmon that we see returning each fall to the Mamquam Channel, in fact, did not rear in the Mamquam Channel. Now, why this is important is in the 1987 year, when it went completely dry, you would expect when that brood year returned, nothing to return. And in fact, that may not be the case. The Mamquam Channel has a few tricks up its sleeve. It's an extremely important spawning habitat for not just chum salmon, but these coho salmon that may have been adapted to, in fact, use the lower end of the watershed. And in some coho fry don't spend a year in freshwater. They migrate to the ocean, rear a summer in brackish water, and then head offshore. Anyway, an interesting story about coho on the Mamquam Channel. So as we discussed, from the very first years after its construction, Mamquam Channel had periods of drying, particularly below the enumeration weir, where in most years a significant portion of the lower end of the channel would go dry. Now what that meant is there was significant numbers of coho fry stranded in various pools throughout that reach. Now there was a large pool formed just below the enumeration weir. It was actually excavated as a holding area for adults before they came into the fish trap. And during dry years, that pool would sustain large numbers of coho fry because they felt the deeper water was safe, but in fact it wasn't particularly deep. It was less than a meter deep, and it would go dry, and many thousands of juvenile coho could die. So we were experimenting on different techniques on how to provide refuge areas. This is before the major rebuild of the channel in the 1990s, focusing on coho salmon. So one of these experimental tools was something called the Refuge Box. And if you see the yellow arrow with Bob Brown standing beside it, it was a simple wooden box. It was a plywood box 4x4 on the upper top, and then it went deep into the ground, roughly 7 feet deep into the ground. And there was actually an upwelling groundwater flow out of the box and then a little entrance into the box. And the idea, as that pool became shallow, the juveniles would start to look for deeper water and would find the box and then go down to the bottom. In fact, it worked really, really well. But the surprise was it didn't work just for late summer low flow. It turned out to be a really popular place for juveniles to spend the winter. And typically we found that during the daylight hours, coho would be either deep in the rock banks or down at the bottom of this refuge box, and they would come out at night to forage. So it was very interesting. That simple 4x4 box, roughly 1.2 meters square, often held up to 1,500 coho juveniles. It was an interesting study. The box still exists. It has a removable lid. And if nothing else, it might be useful to look at today to see if the numbers still are sustaining, and just as a place to have deeper discussions on what do these fish need for cover, either late summer cover or over winter cover. Refuge Box, well worth looking at. So a lot of the coho data that was generated in Mamquam River studies or Mamquam Channel studies from the 1980s is actually summarized in a report about coho salmon use of these enhanced groundwater channels. And I provided a link to it. It's a really well worth reading. It gives you an idea of the ecology of coho in these types of habitat. Again, coho salmon were not really a target species when this channel was constructed. It was envisioned as a groundwater fed spawning habitat for chum salmon, but these later studies we found coho use was very high. And there was coincidence coincident studies at a very similar groundwater channel on the Checkhouse River called the Upper Paradise Channel. And we looked at that all through a winter and looked at what the coho in fact were eating. And what we found was the coho used chum carcass remains soon after spawning. When the chum salmon were often finished spawning, the coho salmon would come in and start spawning the late coho, and they would dig up chum salmon reds and alevins. And in fact, the juvenile coho fed heavily on those. So they were benefiting from the chum salmon spawn. And later, when those chum salmon alevins came out of the gravel, about March 1st, a coho juvenile got to about 3 grams. And at 3 grams, they could eat 1 chum fry, probably per night. By the time the coho smolts migrated around May 1st, they were 10 grams, and they could eat 3 chum fry per night. So from March to May, the majority of their food items ended up being chum salmon origin. Many of it was chum fry. So again, when we looked at the Upper Paradise study, it was estimated that about 250,000 chum fry were consumed by coho smolts that in the spring. So the Mamquam channel is similar in size and similar in the numbers of chum leaving it. So it's likely 250,000 chum fry do not get to the ocean because of the coho smolts in the Mamquam channel. And ever since that era, when we looked at the interaction between coho and chum, we were concerned that we did not push the trend too strongly toward coho, at least in the main spawning areas for chum salmon, because we in fact may push that population to where it could not persist. The chum salmon could not persist over the long term because of the additional pressures of these very high levels of coho salmon smolt predation. So after these early 1980s studies of coho salmon production, chum salmon production from Mamquam channel, in the 1990s, there was an opportunity to add additional habitats to the Mamquam channel that would address some of the problems with these summer drying events. And effectively, a parallel system of habitat was created beside the Mamquam channel that had deep refuge pools designed to allow places where large numbers of coho fry could survive the summer drought periods. And also at the same time, a single pond at the extreme upper end of the Mamquam channel was constructed, a deep pond that was meant to be a refuge pond for fish that were trying to get out of these very shallow water conditions in the Mamquam channel. All of it was focused on producing more coho salmon from the Mamquam channel complex, but not trying to push the predation from these coho smolts on chum salmon any higher than already was from the 1980s work. So we were very careful in the design of the new habitats. What on this map is showed as Channel 2 and associated ponds, is we did not want to affect the fundamental operation of Channel 1 as a high-value upwelling groundwater habitat. So that meant that all the channels and ponds in Channel 2 were actually set at a higher elevation than Channel 1. So they did not intercept groundwater that would have normally gone into the upper section of Channel 1. That was the concept. And also, if you look at where the channels were built and the new ponds, they were slightly downstream from the upper end of the Mamquam Channel 1, where the strongest upwelling would have been happening. So again, it was meant to create habitat that was groundwater fed in the wet season, but would have selective drying and the ponds would become isolated, but would not rob upwelling groundwater from Channel 1. That was what the design attempted to do. So the design envisioned that in drought years, the lower section of Mamquam Channel number 1, the original one, would dry as before. That wouldn't change. But in an extreme drought years, such as seen in 1986 and 1987, an adequate number of coho fry, 10,000 or more, In fact, when we did some salvage one year, we salvaged 40,000 coho fry from the upper section of Mamquam Channel. So a large number of coho fry would find refuge in the uppermost headwater pond to ensure a stable coho smolt production, which roughly 5,000 smolts each year, no matter the water level. And actually, no matter the number of coho fry, whether there's 10,000 or 40,000, the ecology is typically only 5,000 smolts can be reared in that amount of habitat. So the studies from the 80s suggested that chum salmon were sustaining strong numbers even with these relatively high number of coho smolts. However, there was a concern that if the Mamquam Channel was modified to support higher number of coho smolts, they may in fact collapse the chum fry production, particularly during poor ocean condition periods. So think about it, in good or bad chum return years, whether there's a 500 chums return or 5,000, those 5,000 smolts would still eat the same 250,000 chum fry. They would basically take as many as they could get down their gullets. So which meant in a good year, when the channel could produce 1.2 million chum fry, maybe 20% of the total population would be consumed. But in a bad chum year, they could consume maybe 50% of the chum fry production or more. So we did not really want that 5,000 coho smolts in the main Mamquam Channel to be increased. The headwater pond was designed to stabilize coho production, but not to expand it beyond levels seen during its early good years. Just a shot of the upper Mamquam Channel, 1984 era. It effectively ended just below, just downstream of this short spur dike. The vehicle's parked on the spur dike, and on the left-hand side, the other side of the vehicle would be the Mamquam River. So the 1996 work took this area and built this large headwater pond that was deep, and we added woody debris. This was the refuge pond for the Mamquam Channel #1, where juveniles that were trapped in the upper portion of the channel, as it shallowed up in the summer, would move to this pond and spend the summer here. Again, it was designed to provide a refuge for the juveniles in the channel, but not necessarily to decrease the numbers of smolts going to sea, but simply to stabilize the numbers of smolts so that roughly the same number would go to the ocean each year from the upper 360 meters of the Mamquam Channel. So in contrast to the Channel 1 design considerations, the Channel 2 design of the various channels and ponds did attempt to expand the numbers of coho salmon smolts, leaving the Mamquam Channel complex. But the idea was to segregate them from the main chum salmon fry migration route down Channel 1. So the design envisioned that in drought years, perhaps the entire section of those connecting channels, those little connecting channels in the Channel 2 area, would dry out first. But the ponds would remain wetted, and they were deep. And these deep ponds were designed as refuge areas, summer refuge areas for presumably large numbers of coho fry that would then enter wetted habitats when the fall rains can't come. So how many fry spend their summers in these ponds, we don't know, but they're probably in the many tens of thousands of fry are in those ponds. So if we look at the entire Mamquam Channel complex, there's about 10,600 square meters of habitat useful to coho salmon juveniles. Now, the Salmon Enhancement Program have something called biostandards. They would estimate in a groundwater channel about 1 smolt per square meter. Now, remember, we've recorded up to 3 smolts per square meter in the Mamquam Channel, so it exceeded those biostandards by quite a bit. Perhaps not every year, though, but just again, it's a very productive habitat. In pond-type habitats, the estimate is 0.5 or 1 smolt for every 2 square meters. So from set biostandards, the Mamquam Channel complex of 10,600 square meters should produce somewhere annually from 5,000 to 10,000 smolts on an annual basis. And this is largely irregardless of how many fry, so long as there's a minimum number of fry to make up that number of smolts. More fry do not make more smolts. Typically, they will be pushed out of the habitat over the following months when the water comes back on. There's only so many smolts can be reared in that amount of habitat. And the estimate was approximately 10,000 smolts, but we do know that very productive habitats can produce higher than this. And in fact, we did do a downstream trapping study on the Mamquam channel complex to give us an idea. Did the drying phase in the summer significantly decrease the volume, expected numbers of coho salmon smolts leaving this area each year? And I'll leave that discussion for the next slide. So we did a number of observations over the years since those Channel 2 ponds and channels were constructed. Firstly, that there was upwelling groundwater coming into the ponds at their extreme upper ends. And it became clear that the coho salmon adults had found these upwellings and were using them. So they developed their own small spawning areas at the top ends of the ponds. The reason this was important is these spawning areas generated coho fry, which then would seed those ponds. So those ponds did not rely totally on coho fry coming up from the channel 1, the first Mamquam channel, swimming up the little outlets into these ponds. It was just another reason to make them more resilient and more likely to be fully seeded with coho fry each year. And also these upwelling areas provided that cool water, well-oxygenated water that provided really good summer refuges for coho fry, particularly during those late summer drought periods. So these were the upper ponds shown with the little green circle, and the little red stars just indicate where these spawning areas are. Now the lower pond, in contrast, shown with the orange circle, is a downwelling pond. It's fed by the various channels coming into it. But during the summer drought period, those channels stopped flowing. So that pond becomes much more stagnant. It has a good organic layer now built up at the bottom from all the leaf fall over the years. And it has low oxygen. It is not a good place for coho fry in the summertime. However, when the flows start in the fall, winter, spring, it becomes high quality winter, spring habitat. And the ecology of coho is it's the winter, spring habitat that will dictate how many smolts go to sea. If you have more fry than required, they will compete, and ultimately the smaller ones will be pushed out and they'll have to find habitat out of the Mamquam complex. Only so many coho smolts will come out of an area. As we've discussed, set biostandards suggested that the total numbers of coho smolts leaving Channel 1 and Channel 2, what I call the Mamquam channel complex, would be expected to be somewhere between 5,000 and 10,000. Now we were interested in trying to identify, did the summer drying of the good parts of the Channel 1 and many of the connecting channels of Channel 2 impact how many smolts actually left the complex each year? So there was a downstream trapping study done in the 2000s, and it was done just down at the lower end, below the two channel confluences around the power line, and it was operated by tenderfoot hatchery staff, which still have the data. But my recollection is the numbers of smolts was in the range of 10,000 to 15,000. So the message was the Mamquam channel complex is producing coho smolts at a level higher than expected for a habitat of that type and size, suggesting that there's adequate summer refuges. The design accommodates the drying in the summer of portions of the habitat, but in reality that has no effect on the number of coho smolts that are leaving this habitat. It is a very high productivity area for coho salmon. So when we look back at the design criteria for the 1996-1990 pond expansion, the Channel 2 expansion, it indicates that the flood protection dike for that project, which was construction as part of the project, was set back a minimum of 30 meters in the floodplain floors from the Mamquam River's edge. So about 20 years later, by 219, the river had migrated up to the dike in one section, and the dike was being undercut and falling into the river and would soon fail. So this illustrates a point. When you work on floodplains, you have to accept that rivers move with time. So it wasn't unexpected at some point the dike would have to be modified, or it would be moved back deeper in the forest, or a choice to protect it to ensure it continued to function as a flood protection for this area. Now remember I mentioned before the Channel 2 and this flood protection dike, the Mamquam River actually in high floods would flow into the Mamquam Channel just below the enumeration weir and just below where the upper footbridge crosses the channel. So it was part of the active floodplain during floods. When the dike was constructed, it no longer flooded from the Mamquam River in that section of the project. So in 2020, rock work was constructed along a roughly 75-meter section of the Mamquam River Protection Dike. And this is a picture of it. It stabilized that bank so that dike would not fail, which it was very close to failing, and the river reoccupying the lower half of the Mamquam Channel complex. So could further work be done on the rock bank? Yes, you can see the natural woody debris, but further woody debris could be added to this rock bank. And one idea might be to put some gravel spurs out from the rock so the gravel could slowly erode. Typically when streams come against a sharp edge, like a rock bank, they dig a deeper scour channel. So it really captures the channel against your dike, which isn't probably where you want it. Whereas a gravel bank will naturally erode during floods and actually fill the channel up so at more moderate flows you don't have a deep channel right against the bank. Again, with a little woody debris placement and gravel placement, I think this could be a much more fish-friendly bank and also not have this bank challenged in floods and falling back into the river on a regular basis. So here's a little conceptual sketch how this bank complexing project might be undertaken. So the channel, the right bank channel that's eroding the toe of the dike, could be re-excavated and put closer to that mid-channel island. This is likely where it was in the 1990s when the setback dike was first constructed and there was a floodplain forest much farther into the active flood channel. So if this could be done at low flow. So the low flow channel would be re-excavated closer to the mid-channel island. The gravels from that excavation in the gravel bar would be moved toward the right bank channel to protect the setback berm. Now before you did that, you could place a large pad of coarse wood. Now that wood could come from a number of sources. There's a large log jam that's accumulated on the outside of the bend on the far bank of the river. Most of the wood is out of the active flowing channel, not providing fish habitat. So some of that wood could be salvaged and hauled around and laid at a pad all along the toe of that eroding bank, just at water level. And then on top of that wood, gravels from these river bars could be placed. To make the area particularly secure for big floods, some rock spurs could be added before you did that work, showed in red. I just identified 3 potential rock spurs that would come off the existing rocks. That's just to keep the river away from that protected bank. And then these rock spurs could actually be buried in gravel, so they become gravel spurs that gravel could slowly erode and heal the channel downstream so it doesn't become deep and bring the river over to the right bank against areas that you don't want particularly to have erosion occurring. So then that gravel, that log debris could be put all along between the spurs and then buried in gravel also. So what would you get over time? The river would naturally move against this bank. You'd have a very rough edge of woody debris. The spurs may be exposed, the rock spurs, and they'll create some scour at their tips. But before that happens, the gravel points will be slowly eroding and healing the channel downstream, just to keep everything as stable as possible. And when the next great Mamquam River flood happens, a design like this would buy a lot of certainty that that setback dike would be there at the end of the flood. Right now, it is quite exposed, and in a very large flood event may fail, and you may find the lower half of the Mamquam Channel and most of those ponds that have been constructed reoccupied the Mamquam River, and it's probably not what we want to happen in the future. These are some ideas worth thinking about. So I just wanted to highlight that part of the 1996 to 1999 project was to develop a series of trails throughout the Mamquam complex. Now before this, the only access to this project was through the golf course. There was a lock gate and you came down the dike road, the major setback dike road. And the actual golf course staff were largely the stewards of this project for probably the first 15, even 20 years of its existence. And we worked very well with them to make sure the channel was functioning. They would watch if there was any problems with it and make sure that nobody was misbehaving with the fish in it. So again, I want to give kudos to the first stewards of the Mamquam channel, that being the Mamquam Valley Golf and Country Club folks. Now, but during the 1990s project, it was decided to make footpaths that ultimately went through the project and then down the floodplain along the river through the Mamquam, down along the Master Channel complex. The trail went under Highway 99 and finally connected to Government Road. This changed the nature on how people would access these projects and actually how much they knew about these projects. Before this time, they were largely unknown in the general community, and these trails changed that. So this little picture showed a picture of that bank protection work, but part of the trail is on the top of that bank, and it's probably one of the reasons why that bank was in fact dealt with. The community really valued these trails for accessing this beautiful natural area. So this trail was built under the direction of SEP's staff to put it in near salmon habitat, but not where we felt it threatened any values. It was funded by the BC Forest Renewal Program. And more importantly, it was constructed by local forest workers that have been displaced by turmoil in their industry at the time. Now, these were local Squamish residents, and they did an exceptional job of building these trails. And I remember they all took real pride in getting these trails built for their community of the day, and I'm sure many of them still live in the community of Squamish, and I want to thank them again for the effort they made back in those days and how many hours of pleasure they've given to their community. So in more recent years, groups like Squamish Trail Society have stewarded these trails. I know there's other groups that have put in funds to make the topping better so people with limited mobility can move on these trails. When I walk these trails, I always enjoy seeing young families pushing baby carriages on here to go look at nature, particularly salmon and wildlife, and learn about why it's so important to protect these types of areas for the future. So all I can say is the community of Squamish should be very proud of what they have done to make these areas accessible to all members of the public, young and old, and their long-term protection and maintenance of these trails should be a priority in the future, as was done during these 2020 bank protection works. So as I've said, the 1983, 1984, and the 1996 and 1999 project habitats appear to be functioning as designed. However, unfortunately, this means there will be significant numbers of coho fry that will be stranded each summer. This is part of their nature. However, However, since there are almost certainly adequate numbers of coho fry in the various safe refuges in the project to ensure stable and maximum coho smolt production each spring, placing them back in the Mamquam Channel complex probably is not the best strategy if additional smolt and adult production is the goal. A better strategy may be to place any salvaged coho fry in the adjacent back channels of the Mamquam River, where they have the ability to move downstream to suitable and extensive habitats of their choosing. So one of the most common observations I've heard about the Mamquam Channel complex over the years is that large sections of this project goes dry each year, and why does not somebody fix that? So, and I've had these discussions for many, many years, but it's my opinion this is not easily fixable issue. And even if fixed, would likely not result in more salmon adults returning. And for the reasons I've mentioned, to talk about refuge areas and the idea of the capacity for coho juveniles and the fact that chum salmon, in fact, aren't affected by summer drying events. So my impression, this is my impression on how the groundwater aquifer works in this area, is that the water table is near the river surface in the wet season from just above the Mamquam Channel complex. So that means the water level in the river and the water level in the aquifer are about even from just above where the Mamquam Channel complex flows into the river, roughly down to the Highway 99 bridge. And I've showed it in these two little red lines, roughly that reach. And in this reach of the groundwater, reach of the river, the groundwater aquifer actually feeds the river. Comes in from the sides. It's either at the same level as the river or slightly higher there, so it's flowing into the river, and that is supported by the observation that the main chum salmon spawning reach is in this section. And we know these late chums seek out groundwater upwellings along the river banks and the back channels. So the chum salmon are telling us where the water table is in the Mamquam River. So if you think about it, above the Mamquam Channel confluence, the Mamquam River lies above the water table and in fact feeds the aquifer through the seepage from its bed. So you have a valley aquifer that's actually at a lower slope as it moves up the valley than the river. The river is climbing faster than the water table, so at some point they disconnect and the river is seeping water down into the aquifer. So the little pink line is the Mamquam Channel. So we know the lower half of the channel typically dry. So the bottom of the channel is above the water table. But the upper end of that channel was dug 3 to 4 meters deep into the floodplain. And it was done to get into this water table that in fact is lower than the river at that point. So if you go even farther upstream, the Tiempo Channel in yellow, the river at the upper end of Tiempo Channel could be 5 to 7 meters above the water table. So again, it's the idea that the river and the aquifer are different in different sections of the river. Sometimes the aquifer feeds the river, sometimes the river feeds the aquifer. And these groundwater channels, depending on where they're located, have to deal with this situation. And it may mean that summer drying is a perfectly normal expectation when you locate channels in the upper half of the salmon reach, like the Mamquam Channel and like the Tiempo Channel. Now what we've done to design around this is do things for species like coho, is digging deep holes that will not be dried out, but they will be isolated. They won't be connected to flowing water. They'll be isolated during these dry periods to keep coho happy in a cool water refuge. So here's another observation, just an observation and an opinion on the aquifer behavior in the Mamquam River. So if you think about it, we see the Mamquam River flowing quite strongly all summer long. There's a lot of water in the Mamquam River, so the bed should be leaking all summer long and filling the aquifer from above, and we should see strong groundwater flows downstream, but we don't. We see the aquifer becoming depleted. So why could that be when there's such good flows in the river? And I think, because I've observed it in a number of rivers, not just glacial rivers, but rivers like the Vedder River, you may have significant summer flows in the river, but very long periods of stable flows. And it appears that the stream bed seals, either from organic materials or inorganic materials like fine silts. But effectively, the bottom of the river stops infiltrating down to the aquifer if the river has been very stable over the summertime. Now, if you think of the Mamquam, and particularly the glacial debris coming out of Ring Creek, it is likely it seals very effectively during the summer period. But what I've also observed, a single summer storm can bring that aquifer up very quickly, and the Mamquam channel can go from dry to wet over a weekend. And what I think is happening, and I've seen this on other rivers like the Vedder, Chilliwack Vedder River, is either these short flood events, often in late August or September, that seal gets broken, but often they're not gravel moving floods. So that probably isn't the mechanism. Or perhaps as the river comes up, it goes on to the dry bars and various side channels that have been dry all summer and weren't sealed. And all of a sudden there's a pulse of flow into the aquifer from these areas that are now providing new water from the larger Mamquam River during these little flood events. So it means a short duration late summer storm event, August, September, can allow the Mamquam River to flow to the river. But I've seen if it's a single storm and it's quite early in September, after a week or so, the channel can start to dewater again. And this often has caused additional stranding events for coho fry that moved around when the channel started to flow again, or even pink salmon adults who have come in and migrated on these summer pulse flows. And if the flows aren't continued, those adults can be stranded. Now, if those eggs in the gravel, even if there's no flowing water because they're so early in their development, if the gravel stays moist, it is a chance that they actually will survive. But this is tough to see, but it is predictable and it will happen in the future. So over the years, I've heard many people bring up concerns about they're concerned about the impact of the Squamish Valley Golf and Country Club removal of water from the Mamquam aquifer for irrigation. So specifically, there's a deep pond. It's shown as red circle here on the slide. They use for storing water from the aquifer, and then they pump out of that pond for their irrigation system. And then the pond refills from the aquifer when the irrigation is not occurring. So people that don't know, this pond existed pre-1983. And in fact, the discharge from the pond at that time, there was a small discharge in the wet season that went down along the bank and into the Mamquam River. And this was the discharge that attracted attention to build the original Mamquam River, or Mamquam Channel, back in 1983. Now, if you recall, the channel was being built when the dikes were being expanded. So when the Mamquam Channel followed up the discharge to the big pond, the big irrigation pond, it swung along the toe of the escarpment there and went upstream past the pond, quite a ways past the pond. And the pond became isolated from the river floodplain when they built the new setback dike. So now the pond's on the inside of the dike, the channel's on the outside of the dike. That's the history. So over the years, when we've observed the groundwater behavior, we've talked somewhat about the groundwater behavior. It's my opinion that pond does not fundamentally change the nature of the aquifer in the Mamquam River floodplain. Here's why. The Mamquam River floodplain is very broad. There's a gravel layer likely underlaying all the way across from one valley wall to the other, even as far over as the upper end of Meehan Creek. Meehan Creek likely is a flood depression from the Mamquam River and or its major tributary, Masheter Creek. Masheter Creek, in fact, many years ago, I think in the 50s or 60s, flowed through where the golf course is. There was channels all through there. So the aquifer is very, very broad. And I think most people maybe know that the Mamquam River itself used to go down to the Mamquam Blind Channel, and it went through what is now the industrial area. But in the 1920s, there was a big flood and it went straight ahead. What this means is there's deep underlying gravel seams that were part of this Mamquam River Delta when it burst out of its canyon. And in that gravel layer is a very large and extensive aquifer. So it's likely when this pond is pumped down, just like a well, they call it a cone of depression. So the aquifer is depressed when you pump your pond down locally, but it's related to how fast water can move through gravel. That's the transmissibility. So there's a depression in the aquifer, but when that pond, they stop pumping, that pond recharges, that depression disappears. The aquifer is unchanged. So what does that mean for the Mamquam Channel? So from our observations, it upwells at its upper end, and in late summer, it's likely about 2/3 of the way down from the top, it stops upwelling and becomes a downwelling channel. In other words, before we get to the enumeration weir, even though it's wet and flowing, it's probably not upwelling, it's downwelling. And so it goes past the enumeration weir down toward the pond, and then, as we all know, it starts to dry at the bottom end. Typically in the summer, it works its way up, depending on the nature of the rain events and flood events in the Mamquam River over that summer. So what can the pond do? It can depress the water table around the pond. We're not certain how far. It may not be as far as we think because the gravel isn't that transmissible for short duration drawdowns. Does it change the nature of the bottom of the channel? It's unlikely. If it's going to go dry, it will be going dry. It's more the upwelling. How strong is the upwelling in the upper portion of the channel? And how fast does it leak as it goes down the channel? So again, it's complicated. This is my impression. So when we designed the later projects, we put all the refuge ponds well above that area of the irrigation pond. And they were designed to be refuges. They would, as I've described, disconnect from flowing water, but they still would provide suitable habitat for coho fry in the summer. From what we can see, they've worked very well as refuges. They've never gone even close to dry. So we've learned to live with both the aquifer behaviors, the land use, that's the Squamish Valley Golf Course use of water, and I think we found a good common ground for this project. So this is a little sketch to get people thinking and talking about groundwater behavior in the Mamquam River floodplain. And these are simply from my observations. For many years, I was hoping to get a hydrology study of how the aquifer actually worked in the Mamquam floodplain area. There was done one for the city wells up at Masheter Creek, but to my knowledge, it did not come down the watershed as far as the various groundwater channels along the Mamquam River. And I visualize the water table as effectively like a hinge. So if you can visualize somewhere above the 99 bridge, and just toward the bottom of the groundwater channel on Masheter, we call Masheter Channel, the groundwater appears to be largely stable throughout the year. Now the river is flatter down in that reach, and it slowly steepens and it rises quite quickly up toward the upper end at Masheter Creek. So the groundwater table appears to fluctuate attached to the bottom end, the hinge at the bottom of Masheter Channel, and the amount of seasonal fluctuation gets more extreme as you go upstream. So each channel in sequence has to deal with different conditions between the dry season and the wet season. So for instance, Masheter Channel, to my knowledge, has never gone dry. There's evidence that the groundwater there is warmer and lower in oxygen than the channels upstream, suggesting that water has been in the ground longer. It's a more stable aquifer and doesn't vary quite as much. And the same thing with Brennan Channel. The upper end of Brennan Channel, which is groundwater fed, largely flows throughout the year, does not have drying periods. It has stronger flows in the wet season and weaker flows in the dry season, but it still flows. And a little farther upstream, and you'll see the two lines. The purple line indicates the water table in the wet season, sort of October through early July. And the little pink line suggests the water table in the dry season, late July through September. And if you notice, it's stable, as I said at the bottom, and the spread between the two is more accentuated as you go upstream. So on Mamquam Channel, I show the dry season roughly intersecting the channel halfway up, suggesting the lower half of Mamquam Channel generally dries almost every year. Now, I did suggest early in the presentation in 1987, the summer of 87, it went below the entire groundwater channel of Mamquam and the whole thing dried up. Now, Tiempo Channel, in contrast, the water table is high in the winter and it flows very vigorously. All these channels up in the upper end flow very vigorously in the wet season. But in the dry season, Tiempo Channel almost entirely dries. So how have we responded to that? Those little blue triangles both in the Mamquam Channel, a deep pond was dug at the upper end that pushes that bottom of the pond below the lowest water expected, providing a refuge. The same thing was done at Tiempo Channel. It hasn't been necessary at Brennan and Masheter Channel. So again, the best and strongest upwelling appears to be in the Mamquam Tiempo Channel during the wet season. It's a very rich groundwater aquifer, but because it is rich and it drains very quickly, very clean gravels, I presume, up there, it actually depletes quickly too in the dry season, unlike the channels in the lower half of that reach. Anyway, if you visualize it, these are fundamental patterns that we can't change. And to a large degree, we've adjusted the designs to compensate, as I've described, for this behavior. So the strong upwelling in Mamquam Channel makes it perfect habitat for chum salmon. It would be more perfect if it went dry every year and there was no coho salmon in the channel from a chum salmon's perspective. However, since we want a multi-species complex, it partially dries, and we've put some refuges in, trying to segregate somewhat the coho smotes from the chum fry so predation doesn't get too far out of hand. So these are all concepts to think about when we look at how these channels are designed and when you're considering future changes to these channels. It's important to understand their fundamental behavior. And this would be worth a good student-led PhD study on the hydrology of these channels in the future. That would be a really interesting thing to do. We did something similar up in the Upper Paradise Channel on the Cheakamus, where a research paper was done that was really eye-opening on how the groundwater table there worked. Anyway, food for thought. So as they say, instead of people's opinions, a little science would go a long way in trying to help us all understand the behavior of the Mamquam River aquifer in this area. So I think an interesting citizen science project would be to place visual water level gauges at the Mamquam River on the lower end of the Mamquam Channel complex and at its upper end, and then at the various ponds throughout the projects, and the refuge pit, which when everything has dewatered is effectively a monitoring well because it records the water table up to 7 feet below the surface. And if all these gauges were surveyed into a geodetic monument, so all the numbers were consistent among all the gauges, and this was done over a series of years, this data would be invaluable if there's ever a future serious look by researchers at the Mamquam aquifer and an attempt to model it, how it behaves. So if we took those measurements in late summer when the channels have largely dewatered and stopped flowing, all those ponds would be an approximate estimate of the water table at their location. So you'd get a series of measurements to getting a sense, how does the aquifer slope from left to right, from north to south, east to west, that sort of thing. How low does it go in these drying phases? All that sort of information would be invaluable if it was collected over a series of seasons. And I would suggest it would be done in collaboration with the Squamish Valley Golf and Country Club, which also would monitor their irrigation pond. So as I said, a little science goes a long way in keeping discussions productive, especially when everyone is playing with the same information. Food for thought. I'd like to summarize some ideas on things that groups could do, individuals and groups could do, that could keep the Mamquam channel productive for salmon in coming years. So we talked about salvaging summer coho fry that are at threat of dying due to the drying of the channel each summer. And we discussed where they could be placed in the channel in the cooler areas upstream, but also an alternative is to move them to the bottom of the channel where it enters the Mamquam River and release them there to continue their journey downstream. So I'll talk a little bit about the ecology of coho fry that leave Mamquam channel, those large numbers that leave right away in the spring, and then numbers of juveniles that drop out of the channel as it is drying, and then these salvage fry, as they are salvaged, can be moved to the river. The ecology of these fish as they move downstream into the Mamquam River and farther out into the Squamish system, potentially Howe Sound, they're often called nomad coho in the literature. And if they survive, they will return to adults to the areas they were spawned in, which is the Mamquam channel. So they're not lost to the production, even if they move out of the channel. So in years past, many thought that all these little coho fry pushed out of these habitats. And I should say coho salmon's ecology is the fry defend territories in the summer. And if you don't have a territory, you have to move downstream looking for habitat. And it was believed that many of the coho fry pushed out of these habitats did not survive. And generally, coho salmon's ecology is they produce more fry than their little streams can support. So there was always these so-called surplus fry, which were later called nomad coho. So research in recent decades have found, in fact, these little nomad coho are a means of building resiliency into coho salmon populations. And it's for those years when stream conditions are not good. So think back to Mamquam Channel in 1987 when it went completely dry. There would have been a large component of the fry actually had already left the channel before this happened. They were the only surviving adults to come back to reproduce that brood year in the Mamquam channel. That's the definition of resiliency. So it's always good to have a plan B, and these little nomads are the coho's plan B. Now, who would have guessed? So if you want to read a really interesting paper on these little nomad coho that turn into big nomad coho coming home, try this link. It's definitely worth your time reading. So here's another idea of what could be done to keep the Mamquam channel productive for salmon over the coming years. Now, it's something I've suggested and it has made some people uncomfortable. And I want to talk about this issue. So the upper 360 meters of Mamquam channel, as we've discussed, is the critical upwelling spawning habitat for all the species of salmon, sockeye, coho, and chum salmon, particularly chum salmon. And I've suggested that each season, this area should be cleaned of fallen branches and any other debris to keep that gravel open and accessible to spawning salmon. This is the core habitat that keeps particularly chum salmon healthy in the Mamquam Channel. And these species, like chum salmon, to a smaller degree, obviously sockeye, but primarily chum salmon, they're already under significant predation pressure from Coho salmon smolts, as we've discussed, because it is such a high productivity area for Coho salmon smolts. Now, for anyone we've been trained that woody debris is good for coho. And in general, that's true in natural streams. It provides them escape cover from predation and flood events. But this is a groundwater channel. It does not have flood events. And it has rock-armored banks, which provide a really high-quality escape cover for juvenile coho. So the center of the channel should be primarily for little fish rearing, but also big fish spawning. So we actually looked at this in a research that was done in the early 2000s, whereas the upper Mamquam Channel, as I've described, was used as a research area for all sorts of studies. But one of them actually had a really interesting study where they split the channel down the middle with a fence, and they actually added woody debris to half the channel and left the other channel open. And they looked at the impact of coho smolt production the next spring. So surprise, surprise, once again, groundwater fed constructed channels with rock-lined bank proved they are indeed unique habitats. When they added the wood, there was a slight reduction in the number of coho smolts from the study section of Mamquam Channel. Who would have guessed? A really interesting study. Here's the abstract. You can dig a little deeper if you want to read the whole paper. But the message is removing the small woody debris from the upper sections of Mamquam Channel will not hurt coho salmon and will greatly benefit the other spawning salmon like chum salmon. So carrying on this theme of what we could do to help Mamquam Channel remain productive. So after all that small wood debris has been removed in the early fall, prior to adult salmon returning, so it looks like this picture from 1984. All the gravel is accessible to fish that will be coming there to spawn. But even with that, there's been a trend happening in Mamquam Channel over the previous years after 1984 that is largely hidden from view. So I'll describe it. If you think about how the channel was built, in this case it starts now with a headwater pond. So unlike a natural stream, there's no gravel moving through the pond downstream. In a natural stream, there's always gravel moving from upstream tributaries through the channel and then down to the delta. So when a salmon builds a redd, it orients with its nose into the flow upstream, tail downstream, and it digs a hole. Well, the way it digs a hole is with its tail, and just the water velocity generated by that tail kicks out the fine sands and silts and the smaller gravels, as big a gravel as they can move. Typically, they can move perhaps a 2 or 3 inch size piece of gravel, and that exposes a hole. And what's left at the bottom is the larger stones, and that's where the eggs are deposited. Then the salmon moves upstream and fills that little hole in with smaller gravel again, and those eggs are protected. But if you think about it, those salmon spawning every year are always oriented nose upstream, tail downstream. So right below the pond, there is no new small gravel to replenish the small gravel moved downstream. So over time, if you walked up to the headwater pond, you will notice the stones are quite a bit larger. And over time, that area of larger gravel will start moving downstream. Effectively, all the small gravel has been depleted. And at some point, if you leave it long enough, that portion of the channel could become unusable for spawning. It will be too coarse. Now, that will take decades. However, it may be very, very reasonable after a number of decades, after 1984 is now 3 decades or more, to actually consider regrading the channel, just pushing the gravel around, flattening it out, turning it over so the smaller gravels are brought up and mixed with the larger gravels. And even if some of the gravels has been lost over time to downstream areas, topping it up with a little extra gravel, particularly upstream below the large headwater pond. Again, it's the idea is we really want to keep that upper 360 meters open, high quality gravel, so it will always fill up with spawning salmon and drive the whole Mamquam channel complex ecosystem. This is the key bit to keep for spawning salmon healthy. So some final thoughts on what activities could keep the Mamquam channel productive for salmon in coming years. So the Channel 2 project, which was those large refuge ponds, had relatively small connecting channels. So adult salmon getting into them, they can get in, I think, 2 or 3 different ways to the upper ponds. There's multiple entrances to build some resiliency in case one is blocked by debris, but they should be inspected just to make sure adult salmon can get up them. They're relatively shallow and narrow. It wouldn't take much debris to deny fish access. And it's particularly important during coho salmon time because I pointed out there's some groundwater upwellings at the very upper end of those ponds, which are actually quite important to keep those ponds full of coho fry, to get those coho adults up to those points where they could spawn in those upwellings. Now, I just want to flag something again about Mamquam channel. Usually the fact that it partially dewaters the season is a negative. But if you think about it, we have a number of channels. The Mamquam Reunion comes to mind, where they flow throughout the year, fed by that intake. But because they flow year-round, they make really good habitat for beavers, which they themselves create some issues for access, creating their beaver dams. The Mamquam channel, while it has supported beavers, they appear to come and go. They really don't feel comfortable in these dewatered areas. They can't build dams. They're more vulnerable to predators. So really the partial dewatering has actually kept a lot of the problems that come with beavers. Beavers bring a lot of positives, but they also bring some negatives in terms of adult access to spawning grounds. So you got to watch what you wish for. Permanent flowing water often means beavers, and the Mamquam channels don't have a lot of beavers, if any, right now. So the last couple points, just this eroding bank, it has to be watched and probably maintained long term. And I've suggested there's probably ways to have a second project that will make it more complex for fish along the bank, but also make it more durable for future flood events. And I think that might be a priority to look at in the future, just to make that bank more natural and less likely to fail during a large flood. And then finally, on top of that eroding bank that was repaired, we can see the trail. I think the trails, as I've said, are beautiful, publicly accessible trails. They give people, young and old, access to this great wildlife viewing area where you can see salmon and eagles, and sometimes you can see larger mammals predating on the salmon. It's just a great place to bring anyone to see salmon here in beautiful BC, and I hope the community sees the value and maintains it as a premier destination as it is for observing wildlife and salmon and educating children of all ages about our natural legacy here in British Columbia. Anyway, I wish everyone good luck, and hopefully this area will remain productive for many, many, many years in the future.